Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a bit cooler in here than it is on the streets, or indeed in the London Tube. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Brigadier General Michael Rouleau, who's the commander of Canadian Special Operations Command. And he's going to talk to us for up to half an hour. His talk will be on the record. We'll then have a discussion for up to another half an hour, and the discussion will be strictly off the record, which means what's said in this room in the discussion stays in this room in the discussion. What we've seen since 9/11 in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also in a number of other conflicts, is a decisive role played by special operations forces. Now, much of it has been discussed in public, either reported by the media, or indeed there's a number of books, including General Stanley McChrystal's memoir of his time in US Special Operations Command, which we reviewed a couple of years ago in Survival, our journal. But part of what is different about Special Forces, in my view, is that they're genuinely special, and of necessity, surprise and maintaining their security is part of their strengths. I mean, a similar example, actually, in maritime operations is the role of submarines, which navies are usually very reluctant to discuss in public for the same sort of reasons. And in the 4.5 years I've spent in the Institute, we've never done anything in our open events about Special Forces. So it's fantastic that the Brigadier General has come to talk about Special Forces after Afghanistan and the point of view from commanding Canadian Special Operations Command, an organisation I know which has been extremely busy over the decade since 9/11 and is operationally engaged even as we speak. General, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben, and good afternoon, gentlemen. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here. We flew into London this morning, and it's always, a man tires of London, he tires of life. I love coming to the city. We're just here for a couple of days, and then we're moving off to the continent to visit some of our troops, and then we'll be back home. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here this morning, this afternoon. Like Ben said, I'm the commander of Canada Special Forces Command. I began my career in Special Forces in 1994 when I went to Joint Task Force 2, which was then a nascent domestic counter-terrorism element that took over from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Special Emergency Response Team. And that element, the CERT, was trained by 22 SAS as they got their feet under them. And so I've been in the SF business for some time now. And I think you'll find that perhaps all my perspectives are a little counterintuitive in terms of what I have wanted to do with the command since taking over in February 2014. So what I'm going to talk about today is just give you a sense of where CANSOFCOM comes from and how we got to where we are today. Talk a little bit about the environment, but I know this group is very familiar with the contemporary and future security environment, so I won't dwell into that other than to sort of focus on what we think that means for us as CANSOFCOM going forward, and then maybe a few philosophical bits on how we see ourselves developing before we go into Q&A. So as Ben said, obviously on the record for the presentation bit, and then we'll move into privileged platform for the Q&A. So just looking at the journey, it starts in 1986 when Canada stands up the Special Emergency Response Team under the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or our federal police force. And that's stimulated by a number of events that happened. The 1976 Olympics in Montreal are sort of a catalyst to be wondering about what we're doing from a CT perspective. Of course, hot on the heels of the Munich experience. But it's only after the Turkish military attaché in Ottawa gets assassinated that the government decides to stand up the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. From the time they stand up until 1993, when Joint Task Force 2 stood up, there was sort of perennial discussions about whether this role better fit a national police force or a military organization, and without getting into the sort of nugatory aspects of the inside Ottawa baseball, Joint Task Force 2 assumes the role from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1993 on the 1st of April. That's after a year of transition with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Initially, Joint Task Force 2 stands up as a de facto domestic counterterrorism force, but it's not long before named operations are being supported by JTF2, whether that's in the Balkans In Rwanda, Haiti, there's a requirement for Joint Task Force 2 to sort of start developing itself in an expeditionary context. The linkages with the Five Eyes and other special forces also begin at that time. So there's a slow, subtle expansion of Joint Task Force 2. My Command Sergeant Major joins me today, Chief Foreign Officer Dan Legault, and he was with me in the unit from, in fact, Dan was there from the very beginning. I got there in 1994. And the evolution is slow, but relatively deliberate through the 90s. It is, of course, in 2001 when 9/11 happens. The unit is committed very quickly after the events of 9/11 to Afghanistan, and that is where Joint Task Force 2's bona fides are sort of put on display, if you will, for Canadians. The government likes what it sees. It gets something that's relatively easy to move about and a military element that garners a degree of strategic benefit. And so, the talk starts to percolate about, well, it's a very small element. What can we do to expand it? Prime Minister Jean Chrétien goes on the record early after 9/11 and says we have to double the size of Joint Task Force 2. But it's only in 2006 when General Rick Hillier becomes our Chief of the Defense Staff and initiates what we refer to as Canadian Forces transformation, that the scene changes. And so when General Hillier becomes the chief, he rapidly stands up a CDS action team, he called it, with about 25 officers divided into three teams: command and control, force generation, and capabilities. And each one of those teams had one special forces officer on it. I was on team 2. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Day was on the third team, and now Lieutenant General Mike Day. And it was General Hillier's transformation that really says, we like what we saw from JTF2, but what we want is integrated special forces effects. We want something where the whole is going to be greater than the sum of a small part of JTF2. We want to stop looking at the Allies to borrow boutique capabilities to support us in an expeditionary context, and we want to rationalize the various joint bits that contribute to JTF2's effects. And so the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command emerges from that exercise and stands up in February of 2006. You can see on the slide that there's 5 units. So Joint Task Force 2 existed. The Canadian Joint Incident Response Unit was created, and that's a chemical, biological, radiological unit. They're both in a dotted box because the two of them, their core mission relates directly back to the national interest in terms of domestic counter-terrorism, and so we would refer to those two units as our national mission force. The third element there is the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. It was created from nothing in 2006 and resembles, I think, in some ways, the Special Forces Support Group, maybe a Ranger Battalion in the United States. It was initially developed to provide the cordon, block, fire support, cutoff elements in an expeditionary context for precision strike, but has grown into much more than that. And so it has really got Special Forces assistance at the core of its repertoire. The ability to send a unit downrange and to help capacity build militaries in fragile or failing states. 427 Special Operations Aviation Squadron was a rotary wing element that belonged to the Air Force that supported us and was decided in the transformation era that it would be chopped to CANSOFCOM OPCOM Mike. So under operational command to the commander of CANSOFCOM, a very unique arrangement where an Air Force squadron is detached, if you will, with the Air Force retaining, air crew certification, flight safety, standards, all that stuff stays with Big Blue. But de facto, that squadron belongs to the command. And then in 2012, we stood up the CSOT-C, which is the Canadian Special Operations Training Center, a schoolhouse. A schoolhouse which would harmonize pan-command individual training, and as you'll see, and we can discuss it more in the Q&A, which is now emerging into areas of rapidly prototyped lessons learned, professional military education for our Special Forces trades, and human performance at a very high level. So that's CSOT-C. And so we find ourselves in 2015 as a 9-year-old organization. And as I say to people, when you're 9 years old, your parents don't want to leave you in the living room alone if they're going to go out to dinner because they think you might break something. So we don't have the sort of 100 years of history that some of our services do. So being 9 has some downsides. But as I say to people as well, when you're 9 years old and you're confronted with a problem, you don't have a lot of prejudice kind of views that you bring to the table. There's not a lot of biases that are built up when you're 9, so you tend to look at things from a fresh perspective. And so there's advantages to being 9 years old. And so the essence of my talk here today is to discuss a little bit about the CAN-SOFCOM strategy that we just tabled last week in Canada, which basically maps out our path between now and 2025, with a particular focus on between now and 2018 to get us to a line of departure to finish the project, if you will. But there you go, we're 9 years old. We are a joint integrated interagency command. There are representations from various different organizations that belong in CAN-SOFCOM. We have elements that are at very high readiness, whose readiness is measured in minutes and hours, and we have elements that are at high readiness, hours and days and weeks. We put an enormous premium on not only maintaining but developing the bonds of trust that exist between us and our senior military leadership, and part of that depends on better communicating who we are, what we represent, where our value proposition is, where we're useful in the joint fight, but also where we're not useful. Because frankly, I think since 9/11, there's perhaps some who think that SOF are the answer to every problem, and we're quick to point out that we are in fact definitely not that. There are inherent limitations to Special Operations Forces, and we have to be very circumspect about where we think that we should be applied. Core business for CAN-SOFCOM will always center on the precision kinetic effects. But there is many areas in the non-kinetic repertoire that we think that we can contribute to. And of course, the truism is, as the Americans have articulated, is the fifth soft truth. Special forces can do very little if they don't have the support of joint partners. And so I think that's an important point to underscore. So here we are today. At the top of the slide, you see there's a variety of interagency actors there, and there's Canadian Armed Forces logos that are there, and there's international Five Eyes logos that are there. So it kind of speaks to the fact that we're a military organization who's very well connected into the sort of Government of Canada national security fabric, but I think we're also very well connected into the Allied Special Operations Forces fabric, or as Admiral Bill McRaven would have called, the Global SOF Network. As an aside, we just had Admiral McRaven out to Ottawa on Friday of last week, where he was awarded the Meritorious Service Cross by our Governor General for the work that he did in promoting the Global SOF Network. You have the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command Headquarters. I answer to the Chief of the Defence Staff, and so in the context of the Canadian Forces, I am what they would refer to as a level 1, astride 6 other senior military leaders, commanders of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, the commander of Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, commander of Military Personnel Command. And so I am a level 1, but truth be told, I mean, there are variations on a theme. Yes, I am a level 1. I sit at some of the tables with the CDS. No, I am not a 3-star general. And so I think, we have to be very aware of how we fit as a level 1 into the organization. But we have a very small headquarters. My headquarters is only 115 regular force people. And very, very small. And our value comes from the fact that we're a very flat organization. That's our strength. One of our key weaknesses is that we're a very small, flat organization. So there's a sort of yin and yang to the goodness there. Below that, you can see the 5 units that comprise CAN-SOFCOM. Sits at about 2,000 people right now. We are still on an ascendant glide slope of investment. And so as the contemporary operating environment evolves, there are still there's still some distance to go before we complete the project of CAN-SOFCOM, and that's denoted by what you see there in terms of FOC and IOC. And so you see of the 5 units, there's really 4 that are still at an intermediate level of capability where the project needs to be completed. Varying degrees of that, and that forms a big part of our strategic planning effort in terms of finding exactly where the right calibration points are of how big a unit needs to be vis-a-vis the tasks and missions that we impose on it. And we're working through all of that right now. But essentially, the strategy is about getting us to FOC. And we are charged with responsibilities across the 5F domain. And so as a formation in the Canadian Forces, we force generate, we force employ. Now, not all the time. Lately, more than not. But Canada, the way it's structured, has a Canadian Joint Operations Command. It's commanded by a 3-star general, Steve Bowes. And that headquarters is responsible to force employ Canadian forces, both domestically and abroad. To compare it to Americans, it would be our one global combatant commander. CANSOFCOM, because of the unique nature of Special Forces effects, does force employ its own forces, but one would expect that for a very mature theater of operations, as we had in Afghanistan, force employment under that sort of regime would revert to Joint Operations Command. For missions that are smaller and more boutique in nature, CANSOFCOM tends to force employ its forces. And so we do force employment, force generation. We also force develop, and so we define the requirement for our equipment program moving forward, and have our own allocation of money to acquire our own equipment. And we also force manage and force sustain Special Forces, obviously in conjunction with the center, but we are a 5F headquarters. At the top right there, you see the disposition of our appropriation from the amount of money that gets committed to operations, about 85%, or that can be tied directly to operations, versus the enterprise functions, which sit at about 15%. Probably more like 17% right now as we refine our numbers, but still I think a fairly respectable ratio. And without getting into the exact figures, I would just point out that our slice of the appropriation in relation to the entire Defence Services program is, I would characterize it as very modest. And so the return on investment, I think, that the Canadian Armed Forces gets for very modest fiscal investment is significant. CANSOFCOM is always got Canada first as its area of focus. And so because we have a domestic counter-terrorism mandate, we are always first and foremost concerned with ensuring that there are domestic effects that are available to Canada and Canadians. So I'll just put that out there and say that that never gets short shrift. Beyond that, my predecessor did a lot of work in sort of dispersing CANSOFCOM's effects throughout the Global Soft network. And as you can see here, so you see the oblong over Canada. We would refer to that as our domestic engagement plan, 24/7, 365. There are significant levels of connectivity and effects that are being delivered across Canada. We're very tightly connected into the national security community in Canada. Below that, you see over the Americas, it is a Government of Canada Canada First Defence Strategy objective to service military support to our partners in the Americas, and that's what you see to the south there. Beyond that, we are in Africa to some extent, the idea being that paying it forward in terms of having a posture in some of the troubled regions in the world is good value, because it gives the Government of Canada a leg up in terms of speedy decision-making in the event that there are national security crises that emerge. So we are substantially engaged in Africa and significantly in the Sahel. We have a robust and persistent footprint in various areas in the Middle East, and one, of course, that's garnered a significant amount of public attention over the last little while is Iraq and the work that we're doing in northern Iraq, and I'd be happy to discuss that a little more in the Q&A. But I think that in some measure, and what we're doing in northern Iraq represents a very successful mission where we see that the Kurdish military is actually quite stable within their area of operations. And then most recently we've engaged in the Asia Pacific to some extent to support Government of Canada objectives in that part of the world. The current and future operating environment, I'm not going to dwell on this for a long time because, of course, you all in the room have a good idea of what that's all about. I think some of David Kilcullen's work recently has been quite interesting in that regard. Suffice it to say, hybridity or the hybrid warfare piece. I had a UK major who worked for me when I was a colonel in force development. He was a fantastic officer. He's back here with the UK military, but he was responsible for my future security environment work, and hybrid warfare was something that we were talking about as early as 2011. Hybridity speaks to simultaneity, and that has a whole bunch of follow-on implications, whether it's, as I'll talk to later, in junior leader development, whether it's in C4ISR. The hybrid warfare context has a whole bunch of sort of implied tasks that we need to pay attention to. The future security environment also speaks to an absolute premium on the intelligence function, the intelligence discipline. And so if Afghanistan taught us one thing, it's that we're clearly an intelligence-led organization. I think going forward, that's going to be especially true. I believe also that the further distribution of responsibility, the further distribution of elements in the battle space is something that we're going to increasingly see. And so when I look back on my career, I started in the military during the Cold War in 1984 and saw, how, generals fought that war. It was really, in fact, politicians for the most part fought that war in the context of force posture was the juice. It was a force posture exercise, and that was really how the Cold War played out. That was a general and Paul Mill war. And then I went to the Balkans and saw how it was very much being kind of fought, whether it was at the MND level or at the battle group level. We opened up the airport in Sarajevo, and I remember my commanding officer of my battle group having CNN with us to try to get through some checkpoints to get down the mountain into the airport. That was very much a lieutenant colonel's war. Then I went to Afghanistan, and I saw, as I commanded many missions over there, that it was very much a ground force commander's war. And then most recently when I go to Iraq, I see that it's very much a deck commander's war. We are entrusting our detachment commanders with a significant degree of responsibility as a function of the mission. And so the more we move forward, the more we see that distribution is something that we have to embrace, have to prepare for, have to pay attention to, and have to make sure that our subordinates are equipped for. And then the other thing I would throw out there, in addition to the facile things like saying we're going to have to operate more in the urban area, that's a truism. The reality is, I'm not sure that the operational level of war is going to continue to exist as we kind of understood it when we went to staff colleges. The more we go forward, I'm not sure that the operational level of war isn't being compressed in many ways out of the business of defense. And really what we're seeing is tactical actions that reverberate immediately into strategic decision-making or adjustments. The space that national security decision makers have, I think, is ever compressed. And I just wonder what that says about the operational level of war. Short of making sure that we have some consistency in our campaign design, I'm not sure that there's much that separates the tactical level from the strategic going forward. And so what does this mean for CAN-SOFCOM? And again, this is CAN-SOFCOM's perspective. This is the world according to me and my folks, and so take it for what it's worth. I would tell you that the first thing is, to my mind, there's no question that Special Forces effects are going to be in demand for some time going forward. That's not to suggest the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force won't. They clearly will. But I think Special Forces will be in demand for some time to come. For us to be able to deliver on what's going to be asked of us by our governments, I think it demands first and foremost to ensure that we have sustainable enterprise going forward. And so the CAN-SOF enterprise as a sustainable thing moving forward is something that we've paid a lot of attention to. We went into a strategic planning exercise for the last 12 to 14 months, the culmination of which is, as I mentioned earlier, our CAN-SOF strategic plan. But the center of that exercise was about making sure that we had a sustainable enterprise going forward as a function of underwriting the tactical outputs that government may want to tap into. I think the second thing that flows from that is continuing to build on the levels of trust and confidence with senior leaders, not just military senior leaders, but senior officials in government. And again, fodder for the Q&A, but having come from the community, maybe a bit counterintuitive, but one of the things that I came to grips with early on was I thought that we were masked sort of under a cloak of secrecy far too much that was healthy. And so we had taken this Joint Task Force 2 culture and we had mapped that onto this emerging thing called Canadian Special Operations Forces Command. And the point of the matter is there's still a lot of people in the Defence and Government of Canada enterprise that didn't know enough about what Special Forces were, and I thought that that was counterproductive. I thought that there was much more upside to CANSOFCOM being a useful tool to the Government of Canada if we were better understood. Now, that's not to say that we exposed the entire thing, but it is to suggest that we thought we had some work to do in terms of strategic communication. Our strategic plan is the embodiment of, I think, some better strategic communication than maybe we've had. So what in terms of junior leader development? I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of work that we have to do to continue to develop our junior leaders to make sure that they're prepared to confront, in a much more distributed way, the challenges of the future, in a way that we weren't asked to when we were captains and majors. And so we're going to be putting a lot more responsibility on their shoulders. There comes an attendant requirement to ensure that the mentorship, the professional military education, the asymmetric leadership experiences that we can try to give them outside of a military context, all of these innovative ways that we need to arm these young men and women to be able to lead in the future, that's what that bullet speaks to, junior leader development. I think that going forward, we did get very comfortable in Afghanistan for many years. It was a very mature theater. It was a theater with a lot of resources. It was a theater with a relatively defined enemy, at least at the operational level. I think going forward, that's going to be less the case. And so I believe that special forces have to be prepared to operate in less mature theaters and potentially have to be prepared to operate in those undeclared theaters in a lower signature manner, as opposed to going in, looking like the big military machine that we did in Afghanistan necessarily. I definitely think that the future security environment is going to require much more and much deeper thinking on our part. And so we need to continue to challenge ourselves to think earnestly about the kinds of conflicts that we're going to have to contribute to in the future. And we're putting a very high premium on that in CANSOFCOM in terms of challenging our people to think much deeper about our profession. We steward the soft profession of arms. That entails a significant level of thinking about what that means for us. It goes right to when we send people on our Joint Command and Staff program, when we send people to do postgraduate degrees. We align their areas of interest with our areas of need in terms of cognitive thought to make sure that we're getting some value for our money there. I do believe that as we go forward, interagency compatibility is going to be needed more than ever before. We were victim of an attack on the 22nd of October of last year where young Corporal Nathan Cirillo was murdered at our National War Memorial. Instances like that just remind us that the speed of conflict right now is such that interagency understanding, trust, fusion, connectedness needs to be there before emergencies occur. The bullet that says paradoxically the need to be closer to the Canadian Army than ever before. There's always a bit of a tension in Special Forces about, are you interoperable with your coalition Special Forces, primarily? Are you interoperable with your joint partners militarily? I think the answer is you got to be both. And so it's a question of which one do you privilege over the other. But the fact of the matter is, moving forward, I think we will be much closer to the Canadian Army going forward than we even were in Afghanistan. Now, we were very close to the Canadian Army in many ways in Afghanistan. They provided quick reaction forces for certain raids that we did. But I think as we look to trying to get ahead of crises moving forward, capacity building missions, special forces assistance, I think there's even more fertile ground for us to consider the Army's role in those types of missions that would have been considered maybe 10 years ago just special forces missions. I do think there's more room to consider where general purpose forces fit into that as a function of preserving some of the finite capacity special forces have to orient to the next problem set. And of course, tailoring our equipment program. I think there's no question that the adversary is very proactive, very well financed, very innovative, taking commercial off-the-shelf technologies and making them applicable to the battle space. We need to be equally so. We need to make sure that, as I say to my staff, we're never looking for unobtainium. We're never looking for very complex, elegant, exquisite solutions. We need to favor soft, generalist, low-cost, quick solutions that we can rapidly prototype. And it's a question of discipline. And it's a question of balancing the bottom-up great ideas, because the best ideas many times do come from the shop floor, but balancing that with the top-down discipline that frames the equipment acquisition space so that it is a driven space as opposed to just being an all-you-can-eat buffet for great ideas. Our troops are our credentials. And so in CANSOFCOM, everything we do sits squarely on the shoulders of the men and women who put that 60-pound rig on every day and do the job. I like to think that CANSOFCOM for our Chief of the Defense Staff and for government is definitely, it's dependable, it is discreet, and it is deliberate. Now, not deliberate in the sense of slow, but deliberate even in a crisis action context, deliberate in that we've thought about that crisis, right? We are proactively always considering what the chief might be asking us so that when he asks the question, we have an answer to give him. And so we're always thinking about the next trouble spot, the next crisis, and how we might contribute to it. I'll just speak very quickly to this. If we could wrap up our strategy, if you will, that I showed you earlier into one slide, it would look something like this. And it's an unclassified strategy. On the left, in terms of framing the problem space, you see it's a question of ensuring we understand what the Government of Canada's objectives are. It's a question of authorities. Everything always comes down to generally authorities and command and control relationships. It is a question of what the allies are doing. General McChrystal's recent book, Team of Teams, speaks to that. There is tremendous synergy in the global soft network. Sometimes we have to invest very, very little in a certain place to get disproportionate ROI for our government because there's already allied SF that can help there. And of course, it's about our own people, process, and structure. And so as you move through developing the strategy and implementing the art, really we've got essentially 3 lines of operation in the strategy. We have to win today, we have to posture for an uncertain tomorrow, and we have to prevail in the long term. And as I go back to my initial kind of thoughts, all of that comes back to ensuring that we have a sustainable, credible, and legitimate force. What we ask for on any one issue has to be just what we need, what we think we need, and not building in the 10 or 20% negotiation buffer. What we're looking for is that absolute credibility so that our voice legitimizes over time. And then as you move to the right, it's in a national defense context, that is sort of by definition a relatively defensive regime in nature. National defenses exist to be relatively defensive in nature. In CANSOFCOM, we straddle the national defense and national security divides. And so the issue is having both offensive and defensive regimes in place to offer government in terms of some of the crises that they're facing. So, it's coherence, convergence, it's focus. That is the essence of the CANSOFCOM strategy that we've developed, making sure that we're trying to align our actions to the point where the government's getting the most bang for its defense dollar it invests in us. A couple philosophical pieces. One of the first things that I said to my subordinate commanders when I took over is fair doesn't mean equal in the realm of military affairs. Canadians are relatively egalitarian people. That's who we are. And in the realm of military affairs, that's not the case. And so we have to make tough calls. We have to prioritize. We have to make trade-off decisions. We cannot avoid those things. equality is something that people need to wrap their head around in a sort of more nuanced manner. We are relevant. I think we've been relevant for some time now, but the challenge for us is not to sit on that relevant legacy and to make sure that we're always checking against becoming complacent. In CanSOFCOM, we have a coin of the realm, and it's on the one hand being utterly competent in your soft tradecraft, and on the other hand being a thorough military professional. And so as we tell our troops, if you're out and about in the battle space and you run across someone and they can instantly recognize you as a Canadian Armed Forces soldier, sailor, or airman, then we're doing something wrong. And so we pay a great deal of attention to the cultural setup that we have in the force to make sure that it's healthy, and we're very happy with where it's at now. We do crowdsource a fair bit, especially in the technology space, and so we go relatively far down in our organization to get ideas and to see about, whether it's apps for battlefield IMIT solutions. People like me don't make those decisions. I am the wrong guy to be making big decisions in the IMIT space. I'm a technological immigrant compared to the 23-year-old operator who's out there. And we recognize that. And we celebrate that difference, but we structure ourselves. We structure our processes to make sure that we're leveraging the brains that are out there on those issues. We're about context and not control. My subordinate commanders know that there's not enough hours in the day for me to give them all the control that they might get elsewhere in the force. It is about context. It is about commitment, not compliance. We are too busy in a day to try to lead anywhere else but from the edge. And I think leading from the edge is the way we should be leading, because frankly that's the way that operations are moving towards, and people need to be comfortable in that space. Our troops need to be comfortable. In fact, they need to be optimized in ambiguity. The ambiguous space, the change space, is not something we should fear. It's something we embrace because we select for that. We have to be optimized in that ambiguity. We align everything we do to our values. I believe that there's a great comfort and consistency for the force, and we pay a lot of attention to making sure that we are aligned as a wider command team, and I think that's something that is time well spent. Finally, I would say, we're always looking to grow our competitive advantage, but that means that we have to shed elsewhere. I think it's Peter Drucker, the guru of management, who wrote considerably on strategy and said you just can't keep adding to the plate. Things have to come off, and that's hard. Military organizations are conservative by nature, and they are redundant by nature. We have redundancy in military organizations because that's what saves lives in the battle space. It's how we're raised, and that's okay. But as a leader of an organization, there comes a time where you do have to make tough calls and say that redundancy X or redundancy Y we can no longer afford. Otherwise, you're just piling on, and it becomes an unsustainable piece. So it is about shedding at some level.